Hi everybody, I'm here to talk to you about StarCraft and like how it became like a big success and kind of get to the bottom of some social, cultural, and political forces that were kind of in Korea at the time when StarCraft launched that kind of played a part in making it the game that we know today. So, why am I talking to you about this? Or first off, who am I? I'm Chung. I was born in 1985, which means I was 13 when StarCraft came out, putting me kind of square in the target demographic of people that they were trying to sell the game to. I was entering high school when the game came out, and StarCraft was a game that we played a lot, several times a week, a lot on the weekends. And specifically when Brood Wars came out, we were really kind of invested in the game, and it was part of a really small cycle. I also cut my teeth on the 386, which is, if you don't know, a pre-Pentium processor. My family had a 386 because my mom ran a small business out of the basement. You know, our family was like squarely middle class, and you know, when my parents moved to the US, they were both kind of like working, and we just kind of had a computer in the home for kind of like utilitarian purposes. So my mom wasn't super happy when I started using her 486 that she was kind of like doing accounting and like real stuff on to load up like Warcraft. And you know, by the time Warcraft 2 came out, I was networking with my friends in the neighborhood over a dial-up modem on a 14.4 connection on Errol's dial-up, and we're playing cooperative games of Warcraft 2. So I've kind of been following Blizzard since their first big titles. When StarCraft came out, we were already kind of having LAN parties, but like LAN parties back in the day, before we could drive, we were carrying 15-pound CRT monitors across the neighborhood, then kind of going back home to grab our steel-cased 40-pound PCs with small children-sized processors built into, you know, enormous motherboards. And we'd do this. We'd make these like huge trips, and we would use our TCP/IP printer cables to hook computers up, and we'd be playing like Diablo. In high school specifically, we played a lot of StarCraft, Diablo 2, Soul Calibur, Ghost Recon, and Counter-Strike. And that was because those were the types of games that let all of us play at the same time. And you know, that was also kind of unique because if you remember back in the 90s, that's when consoles and handhelds were really big. That was the era of like Pokemon and Mortal Kombat. So we were the weirdos carrying 60 pounds of steel and glass across the neighborhood to play games. So after I graduated high school, I went to the Naval Academy. I was commissioned as a submarine officer. I went through the nuclear training pipeline. I was stationed on the USS Seawolf. And the USS Seawolf, while I was attached to that ship, was in dry dock, which means we had like super long hours and really long days. We didn't sleep very much, and we had very few days off. So not much of a social life at that time. So one of the ways that I kind of kept my sanity was by playing StarCraft with some of my friends. And after, you know, high school and college, we were kind of scattered all over the place. One of my friends was in San Francisco. Another one who had also joined the military was in San Diego at the time. And this was a way for us to kind of keep in touch. It also was a period of time that kind of cemented my interest in cooperative game design and multiplayer games. Which is why after 8 years in the Navy in 2015, I left the Navy, went to the Game Center, and pursued an MFA in game design. And yeah, that kind of takes us to today. The reason why I'm talking to you about StarCraft is because I genuinely love StarCraft. Like, I really love StarCraft, like a lot. I've been with Blizzard since the beginning, so I'm kind of like emotionally invested in that company as well. You know, since I've seen their entire journey from Warcraft 1, I wasn't there for the dwarf game. But since Warcraft 1, like, I've been kind of following a lot of these intellectual properties. And so I feel like the other kind of reason why I kind of like really love the game is because it was kind of something special to the Korean American experience. Growing up in Montgomery County, Maryland. It was a fairly diverse area, but we were in a neighborhood without like a lot of other Korean people. I didn't have a ton of other Korean people in my life, and so like that was kind of not really a part of like the way that I conceived my identity. During that period of through high school, since we were so kind of like diverse in our neighborhood and the high school that I attended, race was more about what you ate for dinner than having any kind of impact on who you were or like what that kind of meant in the eyes of other people. But by the time I got into college, the kind of impact of racial politics kind of took on a very different meaning. And at the Naval Academy, which is ostensibly this, it's a meritocracy, or it aspires to be, but you get a cross-section of people from all over the country that are coming from very different parts of every state in the U.S. So for the first time, I was kind of having to reassess my identity through the lens of how other people saw me. And kind of around that time, or shortly before, StarCraft had really started getting big, like big in the U.S., right? StarCraft had been out for a really long time, but StarCraft, well, in Korea was like huge. And so there's a lot of like theory crafting about like why StarCraft was big and important and successful. And there's this sort of like narrative of like this inevitability. America had crafted this like beautiful, perfect game, and crazy APM obsessed Koreans like elevated this divine form to like what it is today. But really like StarCraft and how it got started in Korea and how it kind of grew was kind of serendipitous. There's a lot of multiple factors that were at play, and it kind of got big for a bunch of like really circumstantial reasons. So I just kind of want to tell you about this story so you can tell other people. So what is StarCraft? If you don't know what StarCraft is, we can kind of go back to the beginning. It's a strategy game which was kind of defined by Wei Chi, as it's known in China, or Paduk, as it's known in Korea, or Go, as it's known in Japan and the rest of the world. Go was, or Paduk was created 1000 BCE in China, and was kind of like the first recognized strategy game, at least ones that are still played today. Then in 280 CE, chess was invented in India and made its way to the West by way of Persian conquest in India, and then later Islamic conquest of Persian territories, and then it spread throughout the broader Muslim world, and then it made its way into Europe via the Mediterranean. But StarCraft is more specifically a strategy video game, and strategy video games were kind of an extension of the strategy space in general. And what Mule did was kind of take the affordances of the processing power behind a computer and add stuff to this strategy wargaming space. They added an economy, and it extended what that design space would mean as it was translated to digital games. StarCraft, if you drill down even further, is a real-time strategy video game. And this was kind of like the next step in strategy games, where it wasn't just about taking turns and having a lot of mundane calculations done for you. It was taking advantage of the fact that it could handle all of this stuff at the same time. And Doom 2 was kind of the first, and that's kind of where this kind of big cemented divide happened. Real-time strategy games went one way, and turn-based strategy games went another. Which brings us to Blizzard's first foray into real-time strategy, Warcraft, which released in 1994, and then it was followed up in 1995 with Warcraft 2. Warcraft 2, which is pictured on the screen, was a huge success. It came in number 2 behind Myst in 1995, and what Warcraft 2 really did, Warcraft 1, was it innovated the single-player campaign experience. It did a lot of firsts, and the rivalry with Command & Conquer fueled the RTS boom of the late 90s. So let's kind of go back to 1998, right? Like it seems like a really distant time, so let's kind of like recalibrate our brains. So in 1998, that's when the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke, and Bill Clinton was all over every publication. Natalie Imbruglia won the MTV Music Award for Best New Artist. It was also the year of Mulan, Armageddon, Saving Private Ryan, and Puff Daddy's musically backed smash hit Godzilla. It was also a period of time where the 5th generation of consoles in the US were kind of coming to a close, and the 6th generation of consoles kind of first got released. Which meant like the broader global game market saw a lot of really big titles released around that time. Half-Life, Marvel vs. Capcom, and then the kind of nostalgia bombs like Final Fantasy Tactics and Suikoden. So 1998 comes and Blizzard releases StarCraft, and what StarCraft does is it has 3 unique races, which is really, really different. Most competitors still had mirrored factions, so Command and Conquer, the 2 different races were they're kind of like 2 different sides were largely the same, and they had a lot of redundant units. You might have the soldier, and then the machine gun soldier, and then the rocket soldier. And they're all super small, and you couldn't visually distinguish any of them. They're just like ants running around, and maybe they went pop pop pop, or they went shoo. But like that was real-time strategy. Everyone was working with more or less like a mirrored setup like chess, with like small variations. So when StarCraft did this kind of like 3 race setup, it was very revolutionary for the time. StarCraft also featured 3 distinct like races, and those races had like heavy stylistic variation. So you had the Terrans, which are space marines with big guns and tanks and mechs and like a ton of political intrigue and backstabbing. There were the Zerg, which is a biologic alien race that has kind of like big claws and acid spitty guys, and like they were all about swarming their enemy. And then there's the Protoss, a tanky, magical space Roman with advanced technology and lots of gold and stuff. And the game's campaign was kind of the big selling point. That's one of the things that like we now today kind of forget, is when StarCraft sold, one of the biggest selling points was its single player campaign. And the single-player campaign was this like sweeping space opera about despots making like power grabs to control all the Terran colonies, and psionic super soldiers that got betrayed, and that psionic super soldier's eventual rise to power as the new leader of the Zerg, and a kind of like rough and tumble 5 o'clock shadow pseudo love interest kind of trying to get vengeance to like heavy rock music. And then there's like a bunch of visually indistinguishable alien heroes that are like sacrificing themselves to save the entire galaxy, which was like huge. It was like awesome. And when you're in high school, this was it. This was the thing. This was the future, right? Blizzard also shipped with BattleNet, and BattleNet was like mind-blowing, but it also kind of didn't matter. Because like, alright, so in 1998, the way that people played multiplayer games with each other is using third-party clients like Kali and GameSpy. Does anyone remember Kali and GameSpy? Yeah, so Blizzard having its own internal service was huge, and the only thing that they asked of you to use this like free service is that like you legitimately bought the game. But no one legitimately bought the game, right? Because it was the 90s, right? There was the whole kind of like piracy versus authentication war that was happening with developers and just like humanity, and so like everyone was just downloading copies of the game and cracking the game, and so no one had a legit sort of like code that they could type in to use BattleNet. So like it sort of mattered, but it kind of didn't. But we'll see why it does matter in the story of like what was going on in Korea. The other big sort of feature that StarCraft had was a custom map editor, which was like huge. The custom map editor like was what supported this entire game design community of people using this tool to make stuff, right? You could modify the terrain, you could edit units, you could even script using like geographical triggers and score triggers and all this other stuff. And so they created all of these new game types like Defend the Temple, Tower Defense, and Aeon of Strife. And Aeon of Strife, if you don't know, is the predecessor to Defense of the Ancients, which is a mod for Warcraft 3, which kind of became Dota 2 and opened up a whole new esports space. So let's kind of talk about Korea. When the game landed in Korea, it wasn't a traditional success. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about why. So if you don't know, here's Korea. Here's a kind of a closer look. I think the thing that's important to kind of take note of is how big China is. Like, China's really big. Mongolia also big, Russia also big, Japan relatively large. Korea's pretty small. It's a tiny peninsula. And so, like, now we think of Korea as, like, the home of this, right? But in 1998, it was the home of this. So when StarCraft kind of landed in Korea, like, the kind of biggest thing that was happening at the time was the 1997 Asian financial crisis. The Thai baht collapsed because of lending and all this other stuff, and there's this ripple effect that affected a bunch of Asian countries, and Korea was one of them. So in order to try and get out of this like massive economic decline, Korea took on an IMF loan, which is the International Monetary Fund, and they imposed all these austerity measures. So all the stuff that you heard recently about happening to Greece and was it Portugal? I don't know. So yeah, it all the kind of like when they talk about that stuff, the case study is Korea, because Korea was kind of one of the first to dig itself out using this approach. But basically the other thing that it did was it kind of clamped down a lot on loans, and the entire country just lost a ton of jobs. And as these companies tried to stay afloat, they had to lay off tons and tons of people. So for young adult Koreans at the time, that business culture in Korea was all about seniority. So lowest people on the totem pole were the first to get cut. So if you're kind of, recently graduating first into the company, you're out. You were first to go, like not important. And so you have all of these younger adults with a lot of free time, no money, and looking for something cheap to fill that time. There's another thing that was happening is like there was this sort of like pastime decline. There's a sort of slow sea change that was happening. So kids in Korea they used to go to school 6 days a week, up to 16 hours if you account for the not mandatory but kind of mandatory tutoring that they had to do afterwards. So students would go to school in the morning and then they go to hagwon, and then when they were done, a lot of them would kind of like retreat to these like third spaces, hang out with their friends before coming home. So the third spaces that were popular at the time were 당구장s, or pool halls, manhwabangs, which are like comic book cafes, and orak실, Korean arcades. But the arcades of Korea were very different, and we'll kind of get into why. Anyhow, those things were starting to kind of not be popular anymore. So you've got like the older people that got fired and everyone younger than them, and everyone's kind of like looking for something to do, something new, something different. So when StarCraft launched, it kind of really benefited from the fact that there's this huge population of people that are looking for something and willing to kind of play, which is not a given. Like in the US and across the world, like whenever a game releases, it has to compete with other games that are already popular. And with Korea, like there's just lots of players, right? They're all looking for something to do. And something else to kind of consider was that like StarCraft had really low operating requirements. PC ownership in Korea before StarCraft was not really that high. In fact, the most common way that people kind of had access to computers were through these like modem cafes or net cafes. And so it was a place that was kind of like a business center. They had all these computers set up. Korea had long ago invested in like high-speed internet, but it was all government controlled and it was monopolized. So they kind of shouldered that investment. And so these net cafes had pretty fast internet. And they're business centers for people that were traveling, or if you had to take some work home or something like that. But that's kind of like the proto PC bang, and we'll get into that a little bit. But those machines were reasonably good, and if people owned computers at home, they were probably pretty dated. They're just using them as like word processors and stuff. The other kind of like big factor at the time was, like I'd mentioned, digital piracy. So one of the reasons why StarCraft was able to be popular in Korea amidst this whole like financial crisis and stuff like that was because like the 90s were like all about stealing games. And so Koreans that didn't have a lot of money to spend could download a copy of StarCraft, install it on their computer at home, or more likely install it on a computer at a net cafe. So like these like cracked copies of the game were a way for a lot of people to kind of get their first taste of the game. So if you watch any documentaries about StarCraft in Korea, that's not a thing that they're like especially proud of. It's like, oh yeah, we fell in love with this thing because we stole like millions and millions of copies. But it's absolutely a huge factor in why it got big. So the next thing is like the net cafes kind of transition into PC bangs. So PC bang means room. So PC bang means like a PC room. And the transition to this was just because like originally they had people, either like the business owners themselves or the clients would come in and they'd install copies of the game and they started playing and they'd kind of come back regularly. And so like the game was installed for free and people kind of spend a couple of bucks an hour to play with their friends. It's not like they're like have a ton of free time. If you're younger, you got 16 hours of school to deal with. But I guess if you're fired and not looking for a job, maybe you have a little bit more time. So eventually, like this started becoming more popular, and it became the new third space that people started going to. And so this new third space was like, it started off like pretty small. Between 1998, as StarCraft was releasing, there's like roughly 3,000 of them, like these business centers like scattered around the country. And then by the year 2000, after people had gotten like a taste of StarCraft, 21,000, right? Like it just skyrocketed in 2 years. This is amidst a financial crisis. No one has any money. There's no business opportunity. Things are not recovering, right? Like in a good way. And then like this is just like taking off. And so what happens is like all these people start to play and they really get invested in the game, and so like all of these PC bangs, all these people are kind of playing with their friends, but eventually some start getting like way better than their friends, so they want to start playing other people, and then they're like, oh man, like if we just had like a legit copy, we could use BattleNet, and then we could play people across the country and across the world. And so they started buying legit copies. Like they might have kind of like sharewared their initial taste, but like, yeah, they doubled down on it like super hard. So like let's kind of talk about like StarCraft's technological advantage. So 4 years before StarCraft released, the 3DFX Voodoo graphics card came out. Begged my parents for one. I can't remember if we got one or not, but it was like super cool. It made Quake like smooth. Right? It was kind of good, but that started this like huge arms race, right? Like so all these people were playing PC games in the US and Europe that were just like looking sexier and sexier, right? But like there wasn't this like thriving PC gaming culture in Korea, so most of the games were coming out at the time that StarCraft was competing with in the Korean domestic market way too demanding. Like so they just didn't have computers that could run a lot of this stuff. So you know that competition was thinned out significantly. But there's also this like whole social advantage that it had as well. And to kind of understand that, we have to go back to the mid 1850s. So let's talk about Japan, right? And the mid 1800s Meiji Restoration. So the Meiji Restoration basically kind of like put the emperor back into a place of prominence. But the other sort of like big factor was that like samurai at that time, which were like totally still like a thing, started losing a ton of power and prestige and money, and a lot of them were like out of a job. So Japan's like, uh-oh, like you've got all these like battle-hardened like warriors without something to do, like might be bad, right? And so they're like, oh, you know, let's send them somewhere else, like China. And so they sent him to China and started the first Sino-Japanese War. And that whole war was about kind of establishing prestige, right? Commodore Perry had shown up in Japan and they forced their doors open, and so they're like, all right, so like, you know, we don't want to sit at the little kids table, we want to sit at the big kids table, so if we kill enough Chinese people and steal some territory, maybe we can move up and like graduate. So they did. And like the outcome of the Sino-Japanese War was that they were able to claim Korea. They took this tributary away from China. At this point, like, let me actually take a step back and do a quick disclaimer. My research is as good as my research is, right? So I don't claim that this research is perfect. Obviously, I'm kind of like really oversimplifying some of this stuff. And the other thing is, like, I'm going to be talking about a lot of historical factors and cultural factors. And my lens into Korean culture, like, I'm I was born in the U.S., born and raised. So my lens into kind of Korea is through my parents, right? And my mom left in the late 70s, my dad left in the early 80s, and their kind of exposure to Korea has been mostly through newspapers. And then we've all kind of visited a couple of times to see family and stuff like that. So I have this sort of like 1 foot in Korea sort of experience. And there's a lot of things that, obviously history is super messy, right? And there's like multiple ways to interpret the exact same stuff. So I'm giving you the digest version as truthfully as it would feel from the Korean perspective, just so that the story makes sense. But obviously you could revisit the exact same facts from a completely different angle. So like I know this is probably going to come off at least a little like potentially anti-Japanese, and I only mean it to sound that way insofar as to make the story make sense. All right, so I'm putting this disclaimer out there. So yeah, the Meiji Restoration happens, and then by 1910, Japan forcefully annexes Korea, which starts this 35-year of occupation. And this period is remembered in Korea for comfort women, numbering in somewhere around 500,000, and forced labor resulting in up to 800,000 Korean deaths, the legalization of the Korean language, and a requirement for Korean people to change their name to a Japanese name to kind of attempt to eradicate or subdue the Korean culture so that they could assimilate into Japanese culture. There's also violent suppression of dissidents, and there was a lot of material and cultural pillaging of Korea at the time. So if you go to the National History Museum of Korea and you look through the exhibits, the vast majority of those artifacts are on loan from private Japanese collections. Korea doesn't even have the majority of its own historical relics. So this is sort of the context. Oh, there's another thing. If you notice, I spelled Korea with a C. Like, the Japanese occupation was so much about just kind of like being on top of Korea during this period that they changed the spelling from a C to a K just so that it would come after Japan in the English alphabet, right? So this is like legit how it was spelled on maps that are old enough. Yeah, so they're all about like throwing around their weight, right? So when Korea gained independence and went through the Korean War, they were not all about like importing Japanese cultural forms, right? They kind of banned films, music, comics, animation. So what that means is like the kind of like console craze that was happening and the arcade craze in the US was missing, right? No consoles meant like no Mortal Kombat, no Street Fighter, no Tekken, no JRPGs, right? And no arcades meant that like the competitive fighting scene just didn't exist. There were like big companies that, and we'll talk about that a little bit, that rebranded some stuff and imported it, but like super low numbers. Like if you were like a proud Korean, you wouldn't be caught dead in front of Street Fighter, right? Like that was kind of the sentiment in the 90s. So between kind of like a lot of console games just not being available to play in Korea, combined with the fact that it had this like huge technical advantage because it could run on lower end machines, like StarCraft really wasn't competing with a whole lot of other games in Korea at the time. But like now, everyone was like super into StarCraft, and the country reacted accordingly. There's a huge surge in PC availability. Around the same time, they demonopolized the telecommunications in Korea. Like, they'd been doing it for like 10 years, but now that there's this actual demand signal, Korea went from like 0% household coverage of high-speed internet to 70% by the year 2000. So let's frame that a little bit. Year 2000 in the US, we had 1% coverage high-speed internet. Like, we were still AOLing on like a 56K modem. Meanwhile, Korea is like blazing around on like cable and like DSL, right? And like, this is in 2 years. Like, people didn't care about the internet in Korea, and then all of a sudden, like, everyone super cared. So yeah, there's this kind of like step increase in technology, and everyone was trying to get on Battle.net. So StarCraft was making waves, and like that sort of attention wasn't kind of like only reserved to like the player base and like to the people. Like there's a lot of different like forces, the government as well as the private sector and some public institutions, that all found ways to kind of like ride off of this wave and this kind of like dearth of nothing good happening. And they were all kind of invested in StarCraft's success, and they kind of took this like thriving competitive scene and made it into the esport that we see today. So to kind of make sense of like how those forces work together, we have to go back to 1962. So this guy, Park Chung-hee 대통령, like President Park Chung-hee, took over Korea through a military coup. Post-war Korea was this like agricultural country, and it kind of passed through the hands of like despots and military coups and a bunch of like interim leadership. Like it wasn't like a like super stable place. Like it was just not good. It was one of the most impoverished places in the world. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of what like the Korean War looked like, but it was just artillery for days. There's like no trees left. The whole country was just obliterated. There's nothing there. And so they're like, oh, let's try to grow stuff. And like that was kind of going okay. And then like they were trying to figure out how to kind of get stuff up and moving. So when this guy took power, what he did was he really invested in this like chaebol system, which like started this like rapid industrialization of Korea. And so what happens is that like these companies really kind of like turn the country around. So if you don't know what a chaebol is like a large dynastic industrial conglomerate. And what Park Chung-hee 대통령 did was he took these chaebols and kind of like brought them in. So they had like huge, close government partnerships. They had a ton of financial support. They had influence over preferential legislation. And like the government also was all about kind of like selective protectionism so that domestic markets could kind of catch up and stuff. So, you know, anyone that thinks like Korea is like a free market, it's totally not, right? It's this mixed market, it's super complex, and part of it is they had to bootstrap a solution because like things were like not great. A lot of people were starving and it was just like not good. So the chaebol system was responsible for taking Korea in just a couple of decades from like one of the most impoverished countries to like the 11th largest economy in the world. And the chaebol systems had like their hand in like everything: manufacturing, construction, services, media, and even entertainment and news. So when the Asian financial crisis caused like this huge hit to like manufacturing, these chaebols started looking to entertainment as a potential growth sector. And it just so happened that around the same time that StarCraft was being released, South Korea and Japan were in the middle of these like political exchanges. What happened was that word got out that Japan was like circulating through their schools like revisionist history of their occupation period and participation in World War II. Like if you want to take a look at the numbers, it's like super brutal and like ultra horrible. But about that time, like when the US and the international community were trying all these people for war crimes, the USSR started getting like really scary. So they're like, oh, let's stop kind of like going after all these Japanese war criminals. We'll just say like it's fine because we need an ally in that region because it's about to get like super scary. And then like their textbooks were like, oh yeah, like we helped Korea get their economy rolling, and you know, like we opened the doors for trade in Southeast China and Manchuria, and like word got out, and like everyone was like super unhappy, right? Obviously. So what happens is that like Japan promises to kind of take a tougher stance on these textbooks, which totally was like half-hearted, and like they've always been sort of vacillating on whether or not it's actually an issue. Totally an issue. And so when they said they're like, oh yeah, we're going to do something about it, Korea said like, all right, cool, we'll start importing all of your entertainment stuff into Korea. So they're like, all right, like if this is the deal we have to take, let's do it. But then the government's like, all right, we need to brace the public against like all this cool Japanese stuff that's about to come. So let's super invest in like movies and music. And so like that started this whole period of the Hallyu, the Korean wave. That's where you get like pop music, K-pop and all that. And like it's part of the reason why like Korean dramas went from like meh to like being like all over the Middle East and Eastern Asia, and like everyone's watching like people dressed up in like old-timey Korean clothes, like talking super fancy to the emperor and stuff like that. It's because they like really invested in this, and it kind of like hockey sticked up and it got like really good really fast. So all these chaebols were like trying to capitalize on all of this like government money that was being invested into all this stuff. And because like StarCraft was kind of like getting big, they kind of like turned that same sort of like cultural machine that was cranking out pop stars onto StarCraft competitors. And so they made these like larger than life figures out of these people. to the point where like had the same production value as these like really big sporting events anywhere else. And like everyone could not stop seeing the money, right? Like this was super good. Asian financial crisis bad. Like StarCraft awesome, right? And so like between broadcasts and ad revenue and sold out stadiums and sponsorship, like all these people had to figure out one, like how do I ride this wave, and how do we kind of like keep control of all of this stuff. So by 2000, the Korean government had formed KESPA, the Korean Esports Association, under the Ministry of Culture. And they were kind of responsible for like setting requirements for like salaries and broadcasting rights and all this other stuff. So the government kind of had a hand in like regulating esports in Korea. But it also helped that Korea already had a history of like broadcasting strategy games. Like this is a thing that kind of gets brought up all the time. Like it's like, oh man, all these Koreans like are watching Go like every single day. It's just like logging into watch Paduk and like these stones and stuff. But like it was just kind of like Saturday afternoons, right? Like I think this is a fact that actually gets like really super oversold. Koreans do have a history of like enjoying strategy games and stuff like that. But the real sort of consequence of like people watching a lot of Go was the fact that like they already had a formula for how to broadcast this stuff. So they just retooled it, turned it into StarCraft, kind of like turned on like that soccer sort of flair with lots of screaming, and bingo bongo televised StarCraft. Right? And then, you know, like the internet, like I said, just kind of popped up onto the scene, and all of these like newspapers and print publications were like, you know, like this is kind of like the next big thing. So like they started printing the outcomes of like big matches and like projections, and you have all these sports commentators like talking about the game. And so like if you were not a part of StarCraft, like you were like still employed, 35 plus, trying to figure out like if you're going to get fired because of the fallout of the Asian financial crisis and not playing StarCraft, and you like pick up a newspaper and you're like, oh, people are talking about StarCraft? Like what is that? I thought that was just a thing that my little brother played, but now it's like, oh, it's kind of like a serious thing. And so all of these things kind of like work together to ensure it's like financial success, but also kind of enshrine it with this place in the culture. And so this kind of brings us to talking a little bit about the design of what made it like a good esport. Hopefully this video runs. This is a video of a guy named Boxer. And Boxer was famous for his like invincible Marines, right? And one of the things that like you kind of saw on the ramp, let me rewind a little bit because it's like, in StarCraft, you have like these units that the Zerg has that are called lurkers, right? And they can burrow, which means the Terran player cannot see this. Boxer does not know that these are there. And the thing about the lurker is it shoots spines in a straight line, and it does enough damage to totally wipe out a bunch of Marines. Any mortal walking up this ramp would lose everything before they had a chance to react. But look at this guy. He takes one hit, and then what you missed was a scan, that like kind of like sparkly thing to reveal the hidden units. He moves one of them to dodge one of the spines, takes out all three, loses nothing, and then just charges up the ramp. That was not how the game was designed. That is pure magic, right? And then like he goes on to win the game, and like that's cool too. But like that was what was like crazy about StarCraft. Like when Blizzard employees went to Korea and started like watching these televised matches, like, whoa, that's not what we intended at all, right? Like there's this janky pathfinding, there's like all this kind of like glitches. Like there's a way that if you kind of like click rapidly and send all these inputs, your drone could kind of like slide through mineral patches and all this crazy stuff. And Mutalists, if you kind of like keep giving them move commands, they'll bunch up into one ball. So if somebody's looking on the mini-map, it looks like there's like one thing flying across the screen, and then like poof, there's like everything. It's like super scary, right? So all these things that the designers didn't intend, like Koreans found a way to like super optimize and get like super good. To the point where like now this kind of takes me back to like my story. You know, by the time I made it to the Naval Academy, and like some of us were kind of like playing some video games and stuff like that, and they're like, it's like, oh, you're Korean, you must be like good at StarCraft, right? I'm like, I mean, it's kind of maybe like I'm not like Korean good, but I'm okay. But I don't like the fact that you instantly thought I was good at StarCraft either. But like it was also this point of pride, right? Like Korea for besides like North Korea going bananas every once in a while, like was kind of like a geopolitical footnote, right? Like no one was eating Korean food, no one knew what kimchi was. Like most of my friends like that I kind of grew up with and had come over and like eaten Korean food kind of understood it, but outside of like a close circle, like it was this kind of like social vacuum. And then all of a sudden Koreans had an identity. StarCraft, but like beggars can't be choosers. So it kind of takes us to the things that like are considered to be the important things in making something a good esport. One of the things is like the game has to be clear. A lot of the design of the game was focused on legibility. I don't have a slide, but in the original demo that Blizzard took to E3 like a year into their development, like the game was like gross. And everyone was like super sad. They're like, oh, this is StarCraft? And so like they're like, oh no, just kidding. And then like they took the game back home, and then they didn't talk about it for 2 years. And then they like made it look way better. They originally were going to reskin the Warcraft 2 engine, but they rewrote the whole thing. And they had, based off of their original concept art, a lot of kind of like dramatic different sizes and stuff, but by kind of punching up and making the units chunkier, it was like much easier to read. So if you look at this, you might not know anything about StarCraft, but you kind of get a sense that like it's kind of evenly matched, right? There's this sort of natural ability to read the scene and kind of understand what's happening in the game, which is super important for a spectator sport. Not everyone's going to be an expert. The other thing is that the game has to be simple. If you have this like big cow-looking thing over here, it's called an ultralisk. It's supposed to be like 40 tons and like big claws and like super cool. But just by the design of that, like it's not hitting a flying thing. Like the relationships of the game were really simple. Other relationships, it kind of got taken to the nth degree for StarCraft 2, like certain types of units that are like generally pretty good, like a Marine. And then another race, like the Zerg, is got to have some sort of answer. So they've got Banelings. So Banelings better than Marines. But that's only true unless Marines get a stim pack upgrade, which means they can shoot and move faster, which means all of a sudden they are now better than Banelings. But if the Banelings get a speed upgrade and they're on creep, they're still too fast now, and so they're better than Marines again. This kind of like heuristic tree that the game set up was like super understandable, that like somebody with like a quick comment is like, why is that exciting, could explain to you in like one sentence. The whole thing had to be simple enough for people to grasp even if they weren't experts. The next thing is this kind of like game that is skill driven. Like that seems fairly obvious, but there's if you look at Command and Conquer and some of the other games, it was more about making sure that everyone had a good time. So they did a lot of stuff to rubber band someone's advantage, and they kind of like injected either randomness or something else to kind of like make sure that you don't get rolled. StarCraft, it wasn't intentionally designed that way, but Koreans found like all of these areas to kind of like maximize and optimize their play, so that with raw APM, just kind of like cranking out button pushes and mouse clicks and stuff, you could take your mediocre Marines and like totally kill a ton of lurkers and charge up a ramp. If you just kind of like attack moved up that ramp, like you'd lose everything. But if you're an insane human being and you spend like tons and tons of hours practicing and perfecting everything, lurkers are nothing. Which means that like from a spectator's position, it's exciting to watch. You get to see the expression of somebody's skill. And lastly, you have to have a certain amount of uncertainty. So if you play StarCraft, you should kind of get the joke. There's a thing that Korean players kind of pioneered called the 6 pool, which meant you make up to your 6th drone, and then you make a spawning pool, and then you kind of collect as much resources as you can, and then you make as many Zerglings as you can, and then you rush into somebody's base before they've built anything. It was super OP, and all these people used to rage quit all the time on Korean servers, and especially American servers. It's like now affectionately known as like the proto-cheese, like it's the first cheese strategy in StarCraft, and it's not where you build 6 spawning pools, it's where you build a spawning pool on the 6th unit. But what that did was like, when they found all of these ways to kind of like create shortcuts, what happened is like the drama curve like started like spiking really early. You don't know as a player, because of the fog of war, if your opponent is 6 pooling you. So you better be ready, right? And you don't know if, let's say you figure out that your opponent is playing like a different race, there are any number of strategies which kind of get them to peak power at different points in the game. And so a lot of it is about dealing with that uncertainty, trying to work with this imperfect information and scout out what your opponent is doing so you can best react. So those are kind of like considered the four things that make for a good esport according to Blizzard. I think like that was kind of at the heart of their StarCraft 2, the core of their design. And I think it's kind of open to interpretation whether or not StarCraft 2 is a better game than StarCraft and Brood War. And I think that's a whole separate discussion because the two share a lot in common, but there's some like really kind of like fundamental stuff that differentiate the two, and the skills are not exactly transferable. So in conclusion, no one could have foretold that StarCraft would have been a success in Korea. Like, how do you plan to release a game 1 year after a financial crisis that no one knew was coming? How do you anticipate that like pool halls aren't cool anymore, right? Like, how do you anticipate that like Korea, which had been saying that it would demonopolize its telecommunications industry after like 10 years, would finally do it? It was just a shot in the dark, right? Blizzard released StarCraft for an American and Western audience, and there's just so many things that were going so perfectly for StarCraft in Korea that it managed to kind of get this massive following. And in the wake of this following, it kind of like ascended to this like place of esport because a lot of people were really invested in its success. There's some people that kind of talk about like PC bungs and the internet being responsible for StarCraft's success, and that's a little bit of putting the cart before the horse, right? As we've kind of talked about, it was StarCraft that kind of like helped bolster those things. And you know, the miracle of the game's success and its kind of like ascendance to being like this like esports phenomenon was like really like uncertain and fortuitous and kind of like as tenuous as the country that kind of birthed it. So thank you. That's my talk, and if anyone has any questions. Yeah.